morning. Welcome to Seven City. If you're watching online, thanks so much for tuning in today. We are in the middle of a series called Dear Younger Self, a letter from your future. In other words, if you could fast forward to the future and your future self could send a letter to your today self, what advice would be in that letter? Over the last 3 weeks, we've talked about some of that advice. One piece of advice would be to let go of yesterday. Another piece of advice would be to put God first. Last week we talked about a third piece of advice, and that is to choose your friends wisely. Well, today we're going to talk about one other piece of advice that is easy for us to ignore because it comes with a certain amount of discomfort, and that advice is take a risk. You see, I don't know about you, but it's really easy for us to get to a place in our life where we just want to play it safe, where the whole goal of life is to arrive safely at death. And if we're not careful, we just do everything we can to protect our ease, to protect our comfort, to protect the things that feel secure, and we are resistant to the uncertainty. We're resistant to the unclarity, to the risk. On top of that, the older you get, little secret for those of you that are younger in the room, the older you get, the less you like to take risks. Because there's something about being comfortable. There's something about being in that space, in that zone where you feel like everything is protected. And while that sounds fine on the surface, it usually leads to regret. In fact, research conducted by social psychologist Tom Gilovich and Vicky Medvec from Cornell confirms this. Their research revealed that short-term regrets are typically tied to actions, whereas long-term regrets are usually tied to inactions. In fact, as you dig deeper into their research, you discover that action regrets outweigh inaction regrets 53% to 47%. That doesn't sound like much difference, but that's in a 1 week time. But over the course of a lifetime, inaction regrets outnumbered action regrets 84% to 16%. In other words, as you get closer to the end of life and you look back over your life, your greatest regrets are not the things you did, but the things you wish you had done. Another research of 50 people over the age of 95 asked, if you had your life to live all over again, what would you do differently? The three most common responses were, number one, risk more. Number two, reflect more. And number three, do more things that live on after you die. None of us want to end life with a bucket full of regrets. Regrets about the things that we wish we had done that we never did. And yet, to do those things requires that we take a risk. To help us dig into this deeper today, we're going to look at the life of a girl in the Old Testament by the name of Esther. And to help you understand where we're going to go, you kind of need a little bit of backstory on Esther's life. So today I want you to start by giving you a little bit of a glimpse into Esther and what was going on in her life and in her situation whenever she was alive. Watch this.
Esther was a young Jewish woman. She was born into a broken family. She was a minority in an oppressive society. The odds were against her right from the start. But almost overnight, Esther went from rags to riches, from poverty to the palace. And she became the wife of King Xerxes I, making her one of the most powerful women in history. Irony seems to fill the pages of the book of Esther. Just as Persia has unknowingly crowned a Jewish queen, the king's vizier, a man named Haman, is plotting a diabolical scheme to exterminate the Jewish race through a bloody massacre. There is only one Jew in the land who is in a position to intervene on behalf of her people. It's Esther. But it seems as though the pleasures of the palace had begun to intoxicate her. She begins to struggle with what course of action to take. As Esther looked around at the beautiful palace that was now her home, with its luxuries, pleasures, conveniences, and the wealth she had come to enjoy, it must have been difficult for her to imagine throwing it all away in some misguided attempt at heroism. She knew that taking this matter to the king would force her to risk everything she had, including her very life. Perhaps a more subtle approach would be best. Maybe she should just lie low for a while and wait to see how things would play out. Perhaps at some point she would have an opportunity to put in a good word for the Jews without jeopardizing herself. After all, what good would she be to anyone if she were dead? But Mordecai, Esther's cousin, sensing her internal struggle, sent her this message: "Do not flatter yourself that you shall escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from elsewhere. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows but that you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this."
Esther's story is an amazing story of God raising up an orphan girl to deliver God's people. And it all started whenever Esther was willing to take a risk. And from Esther's story, we discover today 3 truths that I think profoundly shape our understanding of risk and how our risk can make a significant difference. Today, I want to share with you from Esther's story 3 truths about risk. The first one is this: risk exposes our excuses. Risk exposes our excuses. Now, I could go around the room right now and I could ask, how many of you are really good at coming up with excuses? And some of you would raise your hands. Others of you would say, well, not me, but my kids are. Or you might say, well, my roommate is. Or you know what, my spouse is. So we're not going to ask you to point fingers. The question is simply, in your life, how good are you at coming up with excuses? And here's the truth. Most of us are good at coming up with excuses in some area, not every area. There's some areas we don't have to come up with excuses. We just do really well at those things, and there's no reason for an excuse. But in other areas, we fight and claw for an excuse any chance we can, because we just don't do so well there. Think about one area of excuse. Think about the area of being late to work. I won't ask you how many of you that fits you. There's some of you would say, yes, that's me. Others of you would say, no, I haven't been to work ever, or late to work ever. And some of you, it's kind of the other extreme. I've never been on time to work ever, okay? Career Builder did a survey on this very issue of being late to work. And here's what they discovered in their 2018 survey. They discovered the most bizarre excuses people gave for being late to work. Some of those excuses, here's a few of them. One of them, somebody actually said, it's too cold to work. Another person said, I had morning sickness, and it was a man, right? There's something wrong with this picture. My coffee was too hot, and I couldn't leave it until it cooled off. My dog ate my work schedule. I mean, I've heard about that with homework, like when you're in school, but work as well. Or how about this one? I was here, but I fell asleep in the parking lot. My fake eyelashes were stuck together. Ladies, I won't ask, how many have been there? Okay, and then this one, this is crazy. Although it has been 5 years, I forgot I did not work at my former employer's location and drove there on accident. We are pretty creative in coming up with excuses, but whenever it comes to taking a risk, here's the thing. Our excuses are always exposed. They always come into the light. Think about Esther. Even though Esther was a Jew herself, which, put this in perspective, nobody knew that she was a Jew. She was the queen, but King Xerxes didn't even know she was a Jew. even though she was a Jew and she was in a position of power, she was not going to save her own people from annihilation. A gentleman by the name of Haman, not so much of a gentleman, was the second most powerful person in the kingdom. He served right under King Xerxes. He issues this decree to have every single Jew, man, woman, boy, girl, annihilated on the same day. And here's Esther, a Jew in a position of power, and yet there are excuses that are bubbling under the surface. What were those excuses? There's some of them that we could kind of guess at, but there's one that we know was definitely the case. Well, a couple of them that we could guess at was the untimely death of her parents. You see, Esther, her parents, her mom and dad died, and she ended up going to live with her cousin Mordecai, who raised her as one of his daughters. And so she could have easily said, God, you've got the wrong person. Because in that day and time, if you were an orphan, you were like a throwaway in society. And Esther could have easily said, God, you've got the wrong person. Another excuse that Esther could have used was the unpredictable nature of the king. You see, King Xerxes was known for his anger. He was known for his rage. In fact, the former queen, Vashti, was banished from the king's presence forever because she didn't do what he asked her to do. So she could have looked at this. Esther could have said, I don't want to be the next on the chopping block. The one excuse, though, that we know happened in Esther's life was the undeserving opposition of Haman. You see, again, Haman, when he issued his decree to have all of the Jews annihilated, he said on March the 7th, on that day, every Jew will be killed. Again, men, women, boys, girls, they will be put to death. And whenever that decree was issued, Mordecai, Esther's cousin, sends the decree to Esther in the palace with instructions, plead for mercy from the king. But Esther relays a message back to Mordecai, and in her message, we find her excuse. This is what she says. All the king's officials and even the people in the provinces know that anyone who appears before the king in his inner court without being invited is doomed to die unless the king holds out his gold scepter. And the king has not called for me to come to him for 30 days. So Esther had every excuse for why she should not get involved in the situation. But again, risk always exposes your excuses. You see, here's the thing you have to understand. Excuses are disobedience in disguise. That's all they are. Excuses are disobedience in disguise. And we can convince ourselves of why our excuse is good, but it just doesn't hold water with God. You see, excuses come with short-term relief, but they also come with long-term regret. And we want the short-term relief, but what we don't want is the long-term regret. We just don't have the perspective to see what's down the road if we don't choose a different path. Excuses are disobedience in disguise. And yet, Esther's excuse sounded really good. Risk exposes our excuses. Number 2, risk requires action. Esther gave Mordecai her excuse to plead for mercy. Again, an excuse that seemed quite reasonable, because put this in perspective, Esther knew that if she went to the king without being invited, she could be put to death. Like, that was the law. You could be put to death unless the king chose to have mercy in that moment. So she knows, okay, Mordecai, this may be fine for you. It's not fine for me. And yet Mordecai is reminding her, you don't understand. Everybody will die if you don't do this. So there's a very emotional component to this, but therein lies the subtle nature of excuses, and that is that excuses always turn into inaction. Have you ever noticed that? You never made an excuse of why you weren't going to work out and then went and worked out. No, excuses always turn into inaction, not into action. John F. Kennedy said, there are risks and costs to a program of action, but they are far less than the long-range risks and costs of comfortable inaction. And that's what happened to Esther. She was paralyzed by the excuse. But Mordecai was unrelenting. He would not give up. He knew what hung in the balance. And in Esther 4:13, we read Mordecai's words. He says this, "Don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all other Jews are killed." You see, action always feels dangerous. Action always feels dangerous, but let me remind you, but inaction is disobedience. And can I tell you that the action, though it may feel dangerous, is never more dangerous than the disobedience that puts you outside the will of God. The disobedience is always more dangerous than the action that you don't want to take. Mordecai doesn't stop there. He says to Esther, verse 14, "If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die." Little side note here. God has a way of accomplishing his will with or without you. He wants to use you. He's calling you to step into it. But he's greater than you. And that's not a license to say, well, God, pick somebody else because I'm off the hook. No, it's still a disobedience issue for you and I if we choose not to do what God is calling us to do. I just want you to know God is bigger and God can find other ways to accomplish his will. The question is, do you want it to be accomplished without you? Esther has to ponder this. She has to face this issue. Am I going to play it safe? Am I going to keep quiet? Am I going to keep making excuses? You see, if we're not careful, our excuses will become the alarm clock that wakes us up outside the will of God because we just wouldn't obey. And then Mordecai shares those words that are now kind of famous words. Maybe you've heard these before. Esther 4, verse 14, he says, "Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this." We always focus on those last few words, such a time as this, that God may want to use you for just such a time as this, that you were born in this moment in history for such a time as this. But can I direct your attention to the first three words? Who knows if? Who knows if God is calling you to write that book? Who knows if the Holy Spirit is leading you to start that business? Who knows if God is nudging you to enroll in that class or to apply for that job? Who knows if God is saying, hey, you've got gifting, you've got talent, why don't you join the band? Who knows if? God does. God knows. And if we're resistant to the who knows if that God is putting inside of us, we will step into disobedience. Is there risk? Yes, but rewards are found on the other side of risk, and every reward you've ever received is because you chose to risk something that puts you in the place where you could actually receive that reward. If we stay safe, we never experience the reward that we hoped for, and that brings us to our final point. Not only does risk expose our excuses, not only does risk require action, but number three, risk begins with a single courageous step. What did Esther do after Mordecai's challenge? She ditched her excuse and took action. And can I say that she took action that outshines some of the greatest actions our world has ever seen, because her action led to the deliverance of an entire race of people. Think about this. In Esther 4, verse 15 through 17, it says, "Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, 'Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. You see, Esther could have clung to her excuses of why it was a bad idea for her to go before the king whenever she knew it could mean her own death. Again, excuses that sounded quite reasonable in the moment. But Esther took a risk instead. A risk that began with a single courageous step. And what was the outcome? In a bizarre twist of events, when Esther made King Xerxes aware of Haman's evil plot to annihilate all of the Jews, the king then had Haman impaled on a 75-foot pole that he had set up to have Mordecai killed on. Haman was the one who was killed on it. As a result, one single courageous step led to thousands of lives being saved. Because one person had courage. One person was willing to take a risk. One person was willing to do what she could do to ditch the excuses and say, now's my time. For such a time as this. Who knows if? And she put it all on the line. Let me wrap up with this. In 1988, a woman by the name of Greet, who lived in England, went into her attic at home. And in her attic, she stumbled across a scrapbook. She hadn't seen the scrapbook before, and she grabbed it, she opened it up, and inside she found pictures and names. She found travel documents and letters. She came down out of the attic with that scrapbook, and she went to her husband, Nicholas, and she said, "What is this?" And with that conversation, a 50-year secret began to unravel. You see, 50 years earlier, in 1938, Nicholas Winton, Greet's husband, was a stockbroker in London. He was planning a ski vacation, a Swiss ski vacation, but decided to change his plans at the last minute, and instead he went and saw a friend in Prague. Whenever he arrived in Prague, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He saw refugees that were living in the most horrific conditions in Czechoslovakia. You see, Jewish homes and shops and synagogues were being vandalized. They were being destroyed. And Jewish parents were frantically looking for ways to get their children to safety because of the uncertainty of the moment and the times. That same year, Britain had begun a program called Kinder Transport, where a Jewish parent could have their child transported to safety as long as they had a host home. 10,000 Jewish children had already been rescued from Germany and from Austria, but there was nothing happening in London. And so Nicholas Winton decided he would start something. So he began to organize his efforts. He was faced with the Gestapo, and he was faced with the pleas of Jewish parents as he saw them trying to get their children to safety and yet being broken, knowing they may never see them again. Nicholas returned to London because he recognized he needed to raise funds and he needed to set up host families, foster homes that could take these kids in. And so he returns to London, and he has a small group of volunteers, and they begin to make copies of these pictures of these kids, and they begin to put them into newspapers as ads, and they begin to put them into church and synagogue bulletins and distribute them, trying to raise funds and trying to find homes that would serve as foster homes for these kids. And in 1939, the very first train from Czechoslovakia to London left with 20 kids on it. In the months that followed, Nicholas and his team lined up 8 more trains that would take children safely to London. And he watched the heartache as these parents would say goodbye to their kids, telling them they were just going on a short trip, on a holiday, but yet knowing inside they may never see their kids again. Seven trains made it safely to London. The 8th train never made it because Hitler invaded Poland and the borders were shut, and the 250 children on that 8th train never made it. In fact, only 2 of them survived the war. But because Nicholas Winton was willing to take a courageous step and do something no one else was doing, 669 children were rescued. 669 children were brought to safety, most of whom at the end of the war were orphans because their parents went to the concentration camps and were killed. 13 years after Greet found that scrapbook in her attic, Nicholas was interviewed by the New York Times. And in his interview, he was asked the question, why did you do this? Why did you do it? And this was Nicholas's response. He said, one saw the problem there, that a lot of these children were in danger, and you had to get them to what was called a safe haven, and there was no organization to do that. Why did I do it? Why do people do different things? Some people revel in taking risks, and some go through life taking no risks at all. Because Nicholas was willing to take a risk. Because he said, you know what, I'm not going to go on this Swiss ski vacation. And instead he goes to Prague, and he's suddenly introduced to an extraordinary need that he realized in that moment. I can't look at this need and not do nothing about it. Nicholas lived to 2015. He died at the age of 106. But what he is remembered for is not only the 669 children that he rescued from certain extinction in a concentration camp, but he's also remembered for those 669 children's descendants, which today is more than 6,000. Why? Because one man took a risk. One man said, I can make my life count. One man took a single courageous step that began to mobilize others, that led to the rescue of children that otherwise would have died. Seven City, I want you to wrestle in this moment with a question. How am I playing it too safe right now? I'm not talking about being foolish. I'm not talking about not using wisdom whenever it comes to decision making, but can I just be really frank with you for a moment? Sometimes what we call wisdom is nothing more than our fear that is holding us back from doing what God has called us to do. Because our wisdom says, well, it costs too much, and I'm not good enough, and I don't have this, and I don't have that, and well, if I had this, I'd be a better candidate for it. And we talk ourselves into every reason why we shouldn't do what God is calling us to do. And as a result, we wake up at the end of life, and we look back at buckets and buckets full of inaction that have now resulted in regrets. Can I encourage you today? Don't do that. Look at your fear in the face and say, that's not going to be my story. Instead, I'm going to step courageously, God, into what you've called me to do. And I'm not going to let disobedience get in the way of that. I'm not going to let regret collect in my life because I was too afraid to take action, and I let inaction hold me hostage. No, would you take a single courageous step. And here's what will happen. When you take one step, the Holy Spirit will begin to show you what the next step needs to be. We want the fog to clear and we can see the next 30 steps in front of us. That's not how faith works. God says, no, you take a step. I'll show you what's next. You and I can do that, or we can go to our grave with those dreams still inside of us and rob the world of what God intended to do in us and through us for his glory. But it requires us to take a risk. Let's pray.